Hi, how
Hello.
are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Thanks for the introduction.
Yeah, thank you.
Was a nice presentation that was set, and I hope that mine will not be competing, but will add to what was said. That you could you can still do BDD and use AI tools. I won't focus on AI so much, or other things like those no code things. But I think like 2/3 of my presentation will be on just the BDD as the approach, and then just a third of it will be about how you can write code yourself. But that third could probably be replaced by no-code tools, as mentioned. I actually don't know whether there is anything already there about no-code and Gherkin. Does it go in combination? But I'm sure in the future, if it's not there yet, it will be.
Cool. So without, and I'm going to just give you the floor one time to start your presentation, and then I'll get back to you as just as before, ask questions and things at the end of your presentation. Okay, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Do we start? Sorry. All right. I think we do. So my presentation is about BDD, and it's more, and I'll try to show it from the perspective that it's more than just acceptance tests. BDD as the approach to collaborate, to analyze and refine requirements, to get testers and developers working together, and to have documentation first and then automate it second. So let's get to it. Before we do, a little bit about myself. I am a principal software engineer at TransUnion. I love mentoring people at work. I founded a C# Discord community with over 8,000 members. And a few years ago, I've been making lots of programming videos, around 100 I've made. And I was passionate about teaching. So I created 2 C# bootcamps. And for that, I've been awarded Microsoft MVP title, which I've kept for 3 years and still keep it to date. And I also have written, co-authored a book, C# Workshop. So that's a little bit about my background. And now about this presentation, what can you expect? So it will be a presentation on BDD technology, and we'll use, just like BDD suggests, we'll use a lot of examples about user stories and refining them, about scenarios and making test scenarios clear, written in Gherkin language, and how can you write glue code in without sacrificing the quality of your test scenarios that you wrote in Gherkin. How can you write good Gherkin code without too many details, but at the same time not have hacky glue code? So, and the first bubble that you see in the corner is a business analyst should be writing feature files, and that's quite a fallacy. And we will go through the presentation, figuring out, analyzing why is it not quite right. And this book is based on my personal experience through a few years working with BDD in different projects, enterprise level projects, and also on 2 books, which I highly recommend you read if you're interested in BDD. It's BDD Discovery and BDD Formulation by Seb Ross and Gaspar Nagy. And also there is the official specful.org website, which has a ton of tips and tricks if you want to write good Gherkin and in general, good glue code, in general, good feature tests. So what is BDD and how do many teams misuse it? And the whole purpose of this presentation isn't really to just say in theory what that is, but to put emphasis on things that I time and time again find being misused. So a feature in BDD is, as already mentioned, written in Gherkin language, and it has several keywords. So for a language, it's quite a small amount of keywords. It's feature, scenario, given, when, then. So feature is a test suite, scenario is a test case, given is precondition, when is your act statement, and then is your assertion. And there can be many givens and many thens, and there should be only one when, because you're testing one thing in a test. So here's an example. Shopping cart is a category that we're testing. So we're changing product quantity in a shopping cart. And we have a persona, OSHA, who is a shopper. So as OSHA, the shopper, I would like to change quantity of shopping cart products so that I can choose how many items I want to buy without going back to a shop. So it's like very, very much like a user story description. This sounds like this description for a feature. And we have a background statement giving shopping cart contains a product, and a scenario, what we're testing. So we're testing that when you're decrementing quantity in a shopping cart, if there are enough shopping cart items, that quantity is decremented. So given product quantity is at least 2, when OSHA decrements product quantity, then product quantity should be decremented. It's just an example. Let's not overly analyze it. It's just to show, for those who maybe don't know, how a feature test looks like. It's supposed to be a documentation first, an example, and at the same time act as an automated test. So what's the benefit of it? How to create it? And why is it useful? Let's find that out. But before that, just a little bit on the code behind semantics. How does that all work? How do you go from Gherkin language to something that can be automated, executed, and run? So on the left, you have a .NET-based solution for tests. In this example, we will be using an open source project called Simple Commerce and acceptance tests. So that project doesn't have acceptance tests. So I didn't create that project, the Simple Commerce project, but I did create acceptance tests for a specific part in it. So this is how the structure looks like, the layout. So you have a feature file, which looks like this, as we already seen in the example. And then you have steps that can bind to that feature file. So you can see in here, change product quantity steps. All right. So one part is the feature file, which defines human readable tests. And the second part is the code, which binds to each of those sentences that you provide with given, when, then keywords that translate into some code that will be executed under the hood when this statement is hit. So when given product quantity is at least 2, this is the line of code that will be executed. And how does it work? Well, it works based on regex expressions. Either this or this regex expression binds to this statement. Then you can see that you can provide arguments and make your tests data-driven as you normally would for these kind of tests. So human readable tests bound through regex to code behind. A feature in BDD should be examples-driven formal documentation, and in sync with code, verified by automated tests. But it always ends up, it often ends up being like this. So what's wrong with this feature? Maybe you guys can answer in the chat. I'll slowly list the things, but I would like also to see some of the guesses, of the ideas of what could be wrong in this example. So I'll give 10 seconds, 15 seconds to think before I answer. And I'm not sure whether I see chat up to date, whether there is a delay. But currently I don't really see anything yet. So I'll proceed slowly. So first of all, names like item quantity box. Oh, I see first answers. That's good. So first one, it's technical, like item quantity label. You shouldn't be using technical terms for documentation if it doesn't necessarily document the behavior that you're trying to test. Maybe later on, item quantity label will become just item quantity text, or maybe it will be text box. You don't know that. It can have different shapes and forms. So being overly too technical, you risk that your feature statements will change. And your test will change. So you don't want to design your tests in a way that is prone for breaking them. Then I see the answer, many when statements. That's right. You usually want to have only one. And then someone said, I think it needs parameterization. That's probably true as well, because you have many when statements. So break those down into several test cases and parameterize them instead. Other things. So many when statements, those technical terms, and then you have dollars and one in quotes. Again, numbers, unless you input those in a text box, shouldn't be put in quotes if the meaning that you're conveying is not that they are text. You shouldn't be putting those in quotes. The only reason why they're in quotes in this example is because it was easy to automate it like this. And another question, should the labels be exact what the element is being tested? The label, the fact that it's an able actually should be removed and changed to just what we're trying to achieve. And we're testing the functionality that we can change the item quantity. So there is some way that we capture item quantity inside the shopping cart. So we don't need to care about the fact that it's a label. It's not the key detail that it's a label. The key detail is that there is item quantity. So we shouldn't be specifying those technical details unless it's a part of our requirements that it absolutely must be a label. Then it would make sense. So the fact label should be removed. Okay. Also, though often used, sometimes you may have different personas like shopper, administrator, a guest, registered user, and so on. And it may be useful. It may be useful for this to be specified. So I may be ambiguous, and it adds clarity if you specify who am I. What about button minus? Are they represented as text? That's also some detail that's technical. It's enough to say when I increase or decrease the quality, because it could be a button, it could be a slider. Unless it's a requirement to be a button or a slider, we shouldn't really focus on that. So it's better off if it was just when I increase or decrease the quality, but not press a button, because button is technical detail. Let's move on. And again, this test maybe was written by a developer who didn't really put much thought into the quality of the test, the fact that it should be covering more things, or maybe a tester. But it's unlikely that the two of them would be writing this thing together. So is there a way to solve the issue, the last issue, that the tests could be written by two people? And the answer is yes. This is what this presentation is about. It's about BDD methodology, which is a methodology first to increase collaboration between people. And we collaborate between business, between developers, and between testers. And this collaboration is based on 3 pillars. And I would even say that 2 first pillars are the most important ones. So you have discovery as the first pillar, which means increased understanding through examples. And you set those examples in refinement. The second one is formulation. So you define documentation via those feature tests, feature files written in Gherkin language. And usually that's done by a tester and developer and reviewed by a product owner, business analyst, or someone similar. And third one, the last one, is only the last thing makes them automated tests, is the automation. So to trust the documentation that it isn't just something made up, we automate, we provide the glue code for the tests, for the examples, and automate them that way. And that way we have documentation that's always in sync with the code because it's tested. So documentation first through examples set by business, developers, and testers is what BDD all about. And there was another question about the previous one. If the first assertion fails, does the other 2 execute? The answer is no, it will just stop. However, there are ways, like fluent assertion, for example. If you know the library for .NET, you can create glue code in a way that it wouldn't really fail on the first assertion. So it's really down to how you implement your glue code. Okay. And what's the relation to TDD and BDD? So BDD approach is writing, the right way to do BDD is to write tests first. So you can define specification for a little thing that a developer needs to implement. And then when a developer does try to implement that specification, they will start from a unit test and then try to write code for it. So it's the first loop. Like the first big loop starts from a feature file with code behind that will fail because there is nothing yet to run against. But you can write glue code and the feature file itself, and it just fails. And then developer basically needs to make that pass fully. And when a developer writes tests to make that pass, they will start from unit tests. So there is one level of tests, like high-level tests in BDD for the whole application. And then developer write many, many unit tests for their functions and classes and so on. So many tests by developer, as they're implemented, will follow the bigger loop of feature tests. So one big loop for feature or behavior tests, and many smaller loops for unit tests. So that's the combination of TDD and BDD. So both two are not the same, though very similar, because they do follow a similar loop. But one is a bigger loop and the other one is a nested loop. And let's get started with the first pillar, which is discovery. And we will explore refinement of user stories using examples. So theory and formal definitions are not enough. So a question to you guys, how to present theory and principles so that it is easier to understand? How to make it easier understood? What's the best way to present theory? And I'll try to catch up with the comments in the meanwhile. Someone asked a question about developers writing BDD Gherkin for unit tests, and QA also writing BDD Gherkin, but for acceptance tests. So who would the BDD audience be for meaning the high-level language test suite? For unit tests, it's not worth writing BDD-like tests because the overhead is quite too big. Let's face it, there is some overhead writing because you need to write not only the glue code but also the feature file. So you're like having not double the overhead but close. So developers, I haven't seen any team or heard any stories where developers would be writing BDD in a unit test level. So and I think in the book Formulation, it's also mentioned by the author that he discourages, doesn't recommend that approach. So it should be only an acceptance test level, like the highest level of testing that you can do. That's the only fitting place for BDD. And someone said about this question, how to present theory and principles so that it is easy understood. And that's right, with examples. When you give examples, theory isn't just formulations, it gets meaning with examples. So here is an unrefined user story, which I hope that you guys find familiar, because this is the kind of user stories I get to deal with when first picking them up, which is just basically notes and thoughts from some business analyst or a product owner who put them down in a story description. So they said, change shopping cart items, item quantity, and they basically gave justification, why are we doing this? So they said our users are complaining about having to go back to the main shop window and add items only from there. Shopping cart as is read-only, and we can only confirm the buy. A user should be able to change the quantity of items bought. So reasonable justification, but it doesn't really it's still not quite refined because it's missing, again, the same thing, some acceptance criteria. So not quite the same thing, but we're supposed to know exactly what we're working towards. So we need to provide that in a user story, because right now we basically have to deduct from a description what we need. So in this user story we have, as a user, I would like to be able to change. So we changed the phrasing from the point of view of a user. So as a user, I would like to be able to change quantity of shopping cart items so that I can choose how many items I want to buy without going back to a shop, which makes sense. It's the same, just rephrased. and the acceptance criteria, a button, text box, and mockup. So the three things are technical details. A button is a technical detail, and text box is a technical detail. So when you provide those technical details, you take away freedom from developer and or the whole team to implement it creatively. Why is it a button? Maybe there is a good reason, but in this case, it wasn't specified in those thoughts. So you shouldn't be starting with those technical details unless you know that your team lacks creativity and you would like to enforce an implementation on them. Actually, such an approach may not be a bad idea if the team is more junior. Then this is good. But if a team is with people you trust who have experience, it's not great. So instead, it would be better to just say acceptance criteria, a way to increase quantity, a way to decrease quantity, and a way to directly modify it. And that's it. However people implement it is up to them. And the worst thing that happened to me when defining technical acceptance criteria in a technical way was this example. There was a user story which was unrefined, and it sounded like this. We had one endpoint in an API, RESTful API, and we had one entity, which I think was it was accounts of a user. So we needed to add support not only getting them, but also removing or updating them, so that their account can be, their data can be refreshed periodically. But then when you think about what removing or updating means, it's actually overriding all data for that user, overriding that user's accounts with new ones. So you don't care what accounts are deleted or added or changed. You just want to feed the latest data and replace the old one with the new one. But when the requirements were formulated from a technical perspective to have one endpoint delete, the other one to put, it wasn't needed. It was a waste. There was a more simple approach to implement this. So when you are technical, you take away freedom from a potentially better solution. All right, I'll come back to the questions when I'm at the end of this first pillar, discovery. So you can provide acceptance criteria with examples right here, like right here, which is like this. When shopper increases quantity, then quantity of the item is increased by 1. When shopper decreases quantity, then quantity of the item is decreased by 1. So basically, we rewrote all the acceptance criteria in the form of examples, which is a viable way to do. And the technical detail, we moved that to the comments. However, a question to you guys: is Gherkin optimal format for writing acceptance criteria? Would you be defining those in user stories? Would you be writing literal Gherkin in user stories? From my experience, I've seen a few teams actually do this in practice, and they were quite happy with the approach. And it isn't a bad approach per se, but it has a drawback. quite a big drawback. And that drawback is that it requires quite a lot of effort to come up with really good quality examples for Gherkin language as you're refining your user stories. And when refining user stories, you should be focusing on just that, refining them, rather than implementing documentation with good examples. That said, you still should write examples, but they don't have to be in Gherkin. They can be improvised as long as they're simple and understood. So what's the better way of doing it? You can really make it simple. So you don't need to use any keywords, just the most simple possible way of how you can figure out writing those examples you can give. So here is how I would rewrite that. So what do we want to cover basically? What do we need to consider when implementing, when thinking of what complexity could this feature decrement, changing item quantity from a shopping cart involve? So we need to consider item quantity, that when it's that you cannot remove items when it's one item, because then you would be deleting an item and you don't want that. But when the quantity is at least one, then you can remove it. When there is not enough items in stock, you cannot remove the quantity, and so on and so forth. And if you're editing the quantity directly, not a number input or not a whole number input is rejected, and so on and so forth. And as you do all of that, as you change item quantity, you then realize, oh, actually, I should also be updating the total calculation. If I have an initial total, after increasing or decreasing item quantity, the totals should also change. So that's basically it. So when you're thinking in examples, it may look like time consuming, but it's actually the absolute best way to refine stories, because it makes you think as a customer, it makes you be involved, and it gives a whole new dimension to imagination and coming up with creative scenarios. So do that, because actually when I was writing an example for this, I did not even consider about quantity update. But as I was writing more and more examples, it pushed my mind to think deeper and deeper on actually what happens in a shopping cart as you change quantity. And oh, one of the ideas was this. So this is just one person, me, thinking about examples. Imagine what a dedicated, imaginative group of people can come up with. And it's a skill that you should train, not only as a quality assurance person, but also as a developer or even a business analyst. Well, not maybe business analyst, but product owner. So imagine the whole team training themselves on this skill of being able to provide good examples when refining stories. Great things come out of that. So consider it. So examples make stories more interesting, down to earth, make you involved. It's a great way to help discovering requirements. When you think about examples, be minimalistic, involve the whole team. So someone from business, development, and testers. When testing, focus on a single rule. So figure examples out around that rule. And the whole point of this, that not only that you prevent bugs before implementation, but you prevent bugs not only do you prevent bugs before production, but you also prevent bugs before implementation, because you create documentation that's already well thought and bug-free, and there is no like interpretation of should it be like this or should it be like that. You have examples, so it's crystal clear. And then we have one question. Don't you have UI UX designers to specify how the functionality should look and behave? No, personally, we have a product owner who usually specifies those examples. So definitely different companies can behave differently, but I would still imagine that product owner would be the main person who would provide those. Now, UI UX person could definitely suggest technical details, how it visually looks like. So, but that still wouldn't be a part of that example stage. You could involve them to come up with creative examples, but that's about it. Yep, probably made a mistake. Thanks for pointing that out. But let's move on. All right. Next pillar is formulation. So this one is very practical, technical even, because we'll try to figure out how to write good feature tests that are clear. Or in other words, how do you write just enough test cases, clear test cases, and why is it not one man's job? So we have this example again. Increase item quantity when a single item in the cart. So given a shopper has added Samsung Galaxy A5 Pink to their shopping cart, and a shopper has navigated to this website, when button plus is clicked, then item quantity text box should have text 2. A very bad scenario. And many reasons why it is. The first one is when you're working with your domain, you should talk in domain terms. So what is that URL actually meaning? What if it changes to something else? Do you want to care? Probably don't. So it's extremely hard when you hard code things like this. When you make it seem like it's a detail that's important, is it an important detail? The answer is not really. You just want to say not the exact URL in this case, but that you're just navigated to a shopping cart. That's it. And the second one we already mentioned, a technical name for a thing that you're asserting. So a much easier thing would be remove that technical thing and just say quantity, and the other one just say shopping cart page. So this is how the transformed page, the transformed scenario looks like. And it still has issues. So what other details are quite noisy and we don't really care about? Another detail is actually Samsung Galaxy A5 Pink. We don't care what exact item we've added to the shopping cart. So we shouldn't specify that detail if it doesn't matter for the test. I know that doesn't matter what the item is, I can remove or increase the quality. I guess the only reason when it would matter is if I had to, let's say and test that, for example, I can have 2 phones in my shopping cart, but I can have 2.5 kilos of candies. So you could test it like this, not to allow 2.5 phones in your shopping cart. So then it makes sense. But in this example, we're buying items of whole quantities, so we don't care. And yeah, so we eliminated the specific item when we changed the button to just be increment. Okay. let's move on. In this example, we were quite explicit of everything needed for the test to happen. And there is one detail that isn't quite necessary. You could say you could assume some of it. As you're testing shopping cart, you can assume that you are in some context and that you don't really need to be explicit when defining scenarios, that you need to go there, you need to go there, you need to go there. So not all state needs to be explicit. And in this case, we refer to the need to navigate to the shopping cart. That can be implied. Where do you imply that detail? You can imply it in a background. And in fact, you don't even need to care that you have added some item in your shopping cart. You can just say that in the background. So some details, they can be implied. Others, they can be implied, but they're still important. And that's when you should use background for details that you want to be reused, but they're too important for you to just imply them. So you specify them through background. So in this case, we have in the background shopping cart contains a product. And then we continue. So the whole test would read, given shopping cart contains a product and product quantity is at least 2. When OSHA decrements product quantity, then product quantity should be decremented. So that's the refactored version. And let's move on to this example with a data-driven test with an examples table. In Gherkin, you can parameterize tests using examples table. And you can provide with less than equals signs the exact values for those placeholders. So for example, the first test case, 0 minutes, 0 cost, the duration would become 0 and cost would be 0. So that parking duration is 0, the parking cost, then the parking cost should be 0. So the example values would replace those placeholders. And for each example, 1 by 1 tests would be run. So this test is actually 3, 6, 9, 12, I think 15 cases. So that's one way how you can parameterize. But there is something quite wrong with this example. And let's go through what's quite wrong. Here is a implementation of that function to calculate the taxes, the cost for parking after a given duration. And you probably already noticed that there are many, many examples, and you may wonder, what do those different examples add? Are all of those examples needed? And the answer is actually no, those aren't the examples we need, because 5 and 6 hours are still the same price. So what are you really testing? That has already been tested. For example, here 30 minutes and 1 hour is €2. So we kind of covered that the price doesn't change after some point. So you could remove some of those scenarios. And then if we go further, you may still not understand what is the justification why certain values are chosen. And in feature test specifically, you can use a arbitrary column. It doesn't matter how you call it. Let's call it a description. So you can use a description column. Note that it's not used anywhere in this test. It's basically a comment which you use to describe your test. You could still feed this description into the test when coming up with an assertion message, but that's up to the glue code to implement, so we won't go into detail for that. But when you provide descriptions, then the justification for each becomes clear. Why did we keep it? So justification for each, that's cool. Next interesting thing, it's sometimes maybe difficult to identify details, not just noise, but details or arguments that we are using when we're trying to make data-driven tests, parameterized tests. We often need to identify where is actually something that we can parameterize. And in this example, what is the parameter? Is it 1? Or is it missing? Or is it extra? Like, do I parameterize 1? Do I have 2 parameters, 1 missing, 1 extra? Like, what is the important thing in here? So given I have 1 missing item from inventory, when auditor performs audit, then they alert the supplier. Given 1 extra item from inventory, when auditor performs audit, then they do not alert the supplier. So what is the parameter? And actually the parameter, in this case, we don't care how many exactly are missing or are extra. We just care about the fact that it's missing or it's extra. And for our example, it can be just 1 extra or 1 missing. So 1 missing and 1 extra are the arguments in here. And one way to make it more obvious is that you can put the argument at the end to make it obvious, or you can put it at the start as well. So those are the 2 ways that I know of. Actually, sorry, at the start is a bad idea, but putting in the quotes or at the end is how you can make it, how you can put emphasis on the parameters. Gherkin language supports multiple lines as well, and the best example that I know of for this is JSON. When testing APIs, you can feed JSON in it, and actually you can even use placeholders in JSON. For example, if you're testing that you can get different items, different users. For example, some user maybe is disabled, other user is active, other is old, not used. You can use placeholders in the examples table just like you did for the other things. So I can just replace the hard-coded one for user ID with the user I get from the examples table. So once again, quite useful, and doesn't even require you to write any extra glue code. Just use this and your expectation will be replaced dynamically. It just does the replace of placeholder, and you will have that URI as well. When given I have get user existing user request, you will have the whole URI already replaced. So that's cool. Yes, so this less equal sign applies for strings as well. Sometimes, and especially in validation scenarios, when you want edge values, for example, one symbol over the limit or 1 symbol under the limit, you may be coming up in a dilemma. How do you actually write it in a meaningful way so that just by looking at it, it's straightforward? Do you literally write it in words, like string over 25 symbols long, or something like that? Like, how do you make it clear? And this is a bit more tricky. Because if you want to really make it clear, the only way that I found for myself, at least, quite a good way is to implement your own little placeholder engine. So you can have like what spec flow does with the examples table and the gherkin, like where you have less equal signs. Placeholders in between those are replaced with exact values, but sometimes maybe you want computed values that aren't just trivial for clarity or for complexity's sake. So in this case, I may be implementing a little detector for placeholders and replacing each placeholder values with whatever it translates to, it evaluates to. So for example, text 26 would be a text with 26 symbols, and same for text 31, text with 31 symbols. So when I write it like this, now it's clear for me what I'm trying to achieve. So if I have name of 26 symbols or more, it will fail with the following error message. The field name must be a string or array type with a maximum length of 25. So that's cool. It's crystal clear what is wrong. Also, should you test name and surname separately? And the answer is probably, from my point of view, no, because they're trivial and all of that is validated at the same time. You're not really touching a different rule. It's just still testing one rule, the length validation. So it's fine to provide all similar values that are invalid in one test case, given that you get the invalid, the reasons for invalid values in one message. So that's one way to do it. Also, you can implement an assertion in a way that wouldn't be checking the exact response body. And I highly recommend that because, again, you don't care about the title, the status, because you already have the status code, and trace ID, what is that even? So if all you care is about errors, then keep it that way. So we just, again, remove the details that impact, hide what really matters. And this is a pretty good test for an API that runs fast, is parameterized, isn't really parameterized, but it's actually testing multiple things in one rule, but multiple values in one test case. So yeah, don't force your readers to care about irrelevant details. Another tip is that you can use a asterisk for grouping similar scenarios, similar statements. For example, if we have a body and we have status code, that's kind of talking still about response. So I can use an asterisk to make it a bit more clear. It gets a bit tricky with implementing glue code in this case, but it definitely makes the whole scenario more readable. It also works for listing. For example, here, like if I have given and like I'm essentially having a list, like some sort of a list of 3 items. So again, asterisk is great for listing items. So asterisk is basically the same as given, when, then. You can replace given, when, then, each of those with an asterisk, and it will be understood the same way. Also, and is not the only keyword you can use to combine to list the same kind of statement. For example, if I have then something happened and then something happened also, I can use and keyword, but I can also use a different keyword. And here is why I should be using sometimes that different keyword, but. So when something happened and at the same time something didn't happen, if you combine those two things with an and keyword, you're actually losing clarity. So let's read this scenario. Given a client has an invalid register user request, when the client sends a register user request, then a registration entry should be created. Basically, we do auditing, and the user should not be registered because their request was invalid. So, however, if I write and when the previous thing happened and I say and the other thing didn't happen, I'm having different feelings. I'm having different thoughts in my head, which I maybe even miss the fact that the other thing shouldn't happen. So to fix this, I can simply use the word but. So the user should not be registered. If I use the word but, it's now more clear. Okay. And previously we said we should have only one then statement in your test cases, but there is one exception. Some scenarios may act as a journey showing basically a happy path, how your system is being interacted from one persona's point of view. Like a typical flow, someone goes to the home page, selects one item, adds it to the shopping cart, checks it out, pays for it, done. So this whole thing captures a journey for a specific kind of user, captures a specific behavior. So if you do this, it's actually a good thing to have a few of those journey kind of scenarios which capture the whole flow. So consider that as well. But don't abuse it, just have a few of those. And maybe there is no flow, no multiple steps in your product, given that you're using developing an API. So maybe then it's not needed. But if you have any UI, then this definitely applies. And now let's go back to questions. Can you suggest how to handle this situation? 2 tests run concurrently, adding, cleaning up a quantity validated by both. One might fail because the actual value is +2 or unchanged. Right. So the problem with this, and we'll cover it a little bit. Actually, we won't cover it, but I will have the example implementation of glue code where I handled this scenario. So you will see how I handled it specifically in .NET. But general advice would be to make sure that those tests have like either those critical tests that when running in parallel have a chance of messing it up, that they don't run in parallel. That's one way to do it. Or that you lock that critical section that you don't want to be changed at the same time accidentally. So locking it would ensure that it's modified by one thing at once and not by many things at the same time. So there are those few ways. I think in my solution, I had to also add like a little sleep just in case. So try that as well. It helps. And last one, how do we write glue code? So I'll just show the concepts and the tools generally that we use. So SpecFlow is what I used in those examples. Selenium WebDriver with Selenium support, weight helpers from Selenium Extras, and Chrome driver. Also Fluent assertions for BDD style kind of assertions. Okay. So when you're writing scenarios, consider similar ones, similar statements. Consider this early, as soon as possible, so that you're not having very similar scenarios, statements, which are a bit different, because that will make it quite painful to refactor or will result in a waste. So identify the scenarios that you could reuse, not the scenarios themselves, but the steps that you could reuse. Next is how do you generate steps in at least through Visual Studio for SpecFlow. If you right-click on your feature file, a pop-up will come with one option being define steps. So choose that and then copy to clipboard, create a steps file, and paste it in there. So this will give you bindings out of the box. You won't have to consider the syntax on how to bind it. It will be straight away for you. All you have to do is to put code in those brackets, and that's it. So I typically have a steps folder, and within the class to which you have steps, you create a class per domain object, and that class should have a binding attribute on it. And this is how you say that this will be understood by SpecFlow. It will try to look for this class when reading the bindings, those regex bindings. And I basically just run the tests and make sure that it builds, because if it doesn't have steps, it doesn't even build. And then if it builds and test failed, then I proceed to implementing the steps. How do you organize the code? How should solution layout look like? In particular steps, have a steps folder, have subfolders for different parts of your application, and one domain function or object should be for your steps. One very common mistake that I see people having arrange act assert folders, and this is wrong because it basically it's for things that are related, it creates low gravity, and things that are related, you'll be looking across 3 places when the alternative could be looking at one place and finding it. So don't have arrange act assert folders. Group it logically using domain objects. And the benefit of this is that the thing that you want to access in your given when then statement then is accessible for you directly. You don't have to go through some global context and get it from there. It's all in one class. So if I have shopping cart as a field defined, I will have it accessible all across my application, all across this class. So it's useful. And if I do, however, come down to a situation where I do something that I need to access from different parts, then you can inject scenario context and access it from there. So scenario context is like a global dictionary of you pass it a key and you get some scenario variable out of it that you want. So you can add stuff to it, or you can get stuff from it, like from a dictionary with key value pairs. And if you want to run code before or after tests, you can use hooks, and there are different kinds of hooks. So you can run stuff before or after scenarios. You can run stuff before or after certain steps. And you can run stuff before or after the whole test run. Not going into detail that much, just why would you want to do that? Remember when I said that how you write glue code shouldn't get in the way of defining clear feature tests? So hooks is probably what you will have to use regardless of how your tests work if you want to have readable features that are self-documenting and that do have, and since they're self-documenting, they have some details that will be implied, and those implied details will be implemented by hooks. Before a feature is run, you want some implicit construct things to happen. So you provide it, you can provide it through hooks. And the summary of this last pillar is prefer logical rather than semantic layout of tests, keep test state clean, because if it's not clean, then as the question has asked, we will end up in problems like that. Scenario should not sacrifice readability. It's documentation first and automation second. And that's about it. So in summary for the whole thing, BDD, behavior-driven development, is a methodology for collaborative development. And examples in user stories reduce the risk of a bug before we even start developing. So it's great. Writing scenarios is the way to go if you want to achieve collaboration between testers and developers and business. BDD and TDD go hand in hand. Remember the double loop, where BDD is the bigger loop and TDD is the smaller one. And have your scenarios as documentation first and automation second, and automate those scenarios so that you can trust your documentation. So that's it, and thank you. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, that was brilliant. And I think I've to throw one question out here. I mean, you went through the whole thing, but how in this scenario do you deal with edge cases?
Could you give an example about edge cases? For example, there was one I think I mentioned about validation edge cases when it's over like the maximum allowed length. So does that fit the edge case description?
Yeah, kind of. I was looking more at when I say more of we write in test cases for a particular product, and so we know what it was designed to do, what it should do. But these some person will come up and do something so out of the ordinary that it breaks. How that's what I mean. How do we think about that in order to pre-plan for such disasters, as I would call it?
Right. I guess if an edge case is a user who misuses a product, then I guess what you could do is to illustrate that user through a journey, like what could go wrong, and instead of having like not unit tests, but like testing one thing, you would test the whole flow. Like this is the flow that the user went through, and this is what may happen. Make sure it doesn't happen. Maybe that journey kind feature test would help prevent such behavior from accidentally happening. And again, an example is maybe all is needed to at least consider what could happen and to prevent that it doesn't happen.
Thank you. And I see you took care of the questions as you was going along, which was which was really good. So I want to thank you for it. And if you could sum up your presentation, let's say in one statement for everybody online, what would it be?
Right. BDD is documentation first and test second, and use it to create collaboration between developers, testers, and business.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for us, and like I say again, I want to thank you for being here, and I want to thank the people from Zapatec for giving us the opportunity, for presenting for the audience. I know it's morning, night, or good afternoon, somewhere around the world with the people that looking in. So thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you.
Thank you too.
And on that note, that now brings us to the end of the presentations for today. And on behalf of Zapatec and myself, I want to thank everybody from no matter where you are for being here and making this a positive for it. And like I always say, if there are any questions that you may have, just post them in the chat, and we will get, and they will be answered accordingly. So thank you again, and happy testing.